what is the roles of the PPPs here? Because they have an important role. And for this, we have to strengthen the instruments and management channels of the different PPPs so that we have a sustainable program. And to see the view and in which context the PPPs throughout their development through time are in, and what instruments exist, what kind of management do we have. We have a group of experts here that are with me today, and we are going to approach these themes. I would like to welcome Marcelo Lennertz. He's a lawyer specialized in infrastructure project regulation and structuring, and he's a partner of Lobo de Rizzo. This is a law firm in Brazil. And also Andrea Sanabria, that is an expert of financial analysis when it comes to structuring infrastructure projects, specialized in modeling techniques. And also Edgard Elosati, that is, he's an advisor, an economic advisor in the concession program of the state on São Paulo. I welcome our three speakers, and I would like questions. And I will start addressing a question to Marcelo that is basically if there is a bias in the public or in the global investment, traditional public investment and PPP. Is there a bias toward PPPs in favor? If it's a good bias, if it's a bad bias, and how to deal with this bias?
Good morning, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be part of this panel with you, Andrea and Edgard. The question can be answered with a yes and then with a no, or even a maybe. I think we now have, and here I'm talking about the coming from someone that works with legal structuring and solving legal and regulatory issues in concession contracts and PPPs in the Brazilian environment. And in fact, yes, we do have now a bias of using de-statization of the private sector involvement to invest in infrastructure of public interest. And we see that in the three different levels of government in Brazil, state, municipal, and federal levels. We have been seeing that in the past few years, there is an attempt to catalyze infrastructure investments by the means of the private sector. So the first part of the question, I would answer yes. So the second part of the question, which is the part that we have to analyze carefully, the private investment in infrastructure, as you mentioned, is extremely important, and especially in a fiscal crisis moment, in a moment where the state has difficulties in financing needed investments in infrastructure. But I think that the private sector will always be working in infrastructure in order to complement the public investment, the state investment, and so that this complementary relationship is the best possible and the most efficient possible. We have to have planning. We have to have clarity about the objectives that we have when we involve the private sector in a given project or not involving the private sector in another project. For instance, the idea here would be to have all these funds that come from the private sector, that they may release the state from investment in terms of its burden, and so that they can invest in other areas that sometimes are just as important in the areas in which the private sector is investing, but that might not to invest in areas that maybe the private sector is not interested in investing, or projects from different types of areas of border investments, for instance, where it's more complicated to involve the private sector. So when we look at that approach in terms of planning, maybe we are not at the best scenario that we could be at in Brazil specifically. I think, in fact, we have right now a large number of concession projects, of PPPs in different areas: sanitation, public lighting, highways, ports, airports. But apparently, the main drive, the more relevant drive for these projects has been more the context of the fiscal crisis and the collection need of the governments, rather than what it should be, in my opinion, the main objective of any attempt of a project structuring for concession or PPP, which would be the best service providing to population at the lowest cost possible, always analyzing the best options possible, and among of these options, the direct public investment. So in this context, if we consider fiscal crisis, in my opinion, this should not be the main objective. It might seem that this is a kind of hidden, and this is a secondary objective, and that the objective of generating a higher amount of payment by the private partner to the public service of that grant, that ends up having a greater relevance than what it should have, and not necessarily the higher amount paid by the private partner for the grant should be a measure of success when granting a concession or in a PPP. And another aspect that is very much related to planning, and it will be very important in the second step. Here in Brazil, there has been a celebration on some biddings that have been well succeeded in order to generate new revenue to the state. But we have to look at how these contracts will be managed over 20, 30 years. And what we can see is that the increase in project number for privatization in the past few years does not have a proportional does not bring a proportional increase in the regulating agency's ability to regulate these projects. So we have a huge increase in concessions, in this portfolio of concessions, without an additional capacity of the regulating agency's ability to regulate, to analyze, to tackle and deal with these concessions over this period, 20, 30 years. Well, I now conclude my initial remarks with this message. So yes, we are involved in the private sector, but I think we do need to improve that that area, the monitoring, the management of concessions, the concessions and PPP contracts that are being mentioned here, and that will be enforced for the next 20 to 30 years. We should start thinking more about the future of these contracts, and not only when we are at the bidding process.
I don't know if Andrea or Edgard would like to make a comment regarding, not only regarding this question, but also regarding Marcelo's comments. Well, perhaps it is important to value training of the public sector, because one way or the other, we should try to improve. What do I mean? The knowledge of the public sector regarding this theme. That would be assessment. So we can continue. Edgar, would you like to make a remark? I know you're that in the room, Edgar. Unfortunately, Edgar, we can't hear you. I can't hear you, Edgar. Your microphone is off.
Ahorita problemas. Si quieren, Edgar, en lo que arreglamos.
We review certain assessments, and in this case, by and large, we carry out a co-financing assessment, value per money, and a fiscal impact assessment. And we see the contingencies of the projects as well, if they're comparable or not. In both cases, the objective is a public asset. So the nature of the transactions that are bidded for PPPs and traditional bids, well, it's different, with the instruments that are used. When we think about the PPPs, we want the sustainability of the project throughout the time and due to the risk allocations that are taken into account for this analysis. And this is why this impacts the type of tools that will be used in order to assess these type of projects. I can say that the bidded projects for PPP are more integral because the sustainability of the project is very important. And the analysis of traditional public works just contracts the asset itself. Now the PPP model pursues to have a referential technical objective. This is why we need more flexibility to innovate from the private sector. And this is why we place the information regarding outputs instead of the assessment that is carried out for traditional public works that by and large are better from the technical point of view. Another difference is that traditional public works, as they do not pursue services and they want an asset, they have to think in the short term. And the PPP analysis, the risks are more explicit. By and large, we pay better attention to them. Now, regarding the PPP project, we could set aside certain risks or ignore certain risks. How can you compare them? Perhaps the way of reconciling them in theory should be as the value for money analysis. With the value for money analysis, we put the same projects in the same place, but it is important to carry out an assessment through PPPs or through OPPs. It's going to depend which project provides you the greatest value for money. But I believe that a responsible assessment is important. We have to structure a project that maximizes the economic uh, earnings for society. So this would be my participation. And then Edgard or Marcelo, do you have any point to add? Edgard, were you able to fix your microphone?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Now, about this theme and complementing what my colleague said,
I think we have to use the analysis of the old from money methodologically. This is the more traditional framework that we have, but I am very skeptical when it comes to its use as a final indicator of a go, no go forward with projects. Economists as well know that when indicators become a target, those are no longer good indicators. And here it seems to me it's more of a delusion of the technical area, and myself includes, that we will take years structuring a PPP project, and when you have all the inputs of this project, when you have a robust for money, someone from the technical area will look at it and add a different value and say, forget this project. And the government sometimes already worked on it, invested, and there is a government plan there involved. So I think that maybe what would be more important than the indicators we will be using on how the projects will be working, if they will move forward to a public work or a PPP, it has more to do with the institutional framework, who is governing who, and where the approvals come from for our PPP. Of course, you have the long term involved, and you have the binding of the fiscal resources involved, and that involves more than public works, but you will find demands in terms of supervision and who will look at it and who will approve it. So I have my personal understanding here. Yes, it is important to have this analysis for money and cost benefit, but you cannot only believe that you will have indicators that you will tell you this is better or worse. And we have inputs of projects that we know that didn't go well. And if you analyze the documents, you will see that several for monies would point to best evaluation. So we have to be very careful in terms of believing that the best technical decision will make us really make the best decision in terms of public policies.
I don't know if you would like to add something. Actually,
And I don't know, Gerardo, if that we could discuss this here, but I have two questions, one for Andrea and Edgard, and you as well. An initial question is, when we talk about for money, or in the experience in Latin America, it's more as a whole. Have you seen an attempt to monitor over the concession contract this and other indicators, how that project that was bid in terms of a public policy and public policy slash fiscal policy, believing that you would have results, and how did it behave in the first 4 years or the first 8 years and so on, if you have any type of evaluation? And this is my first question. And then Andrea, I think she has more experience with assessment, right? Assessment of PPP's contracts. Have been used of indicator to make a follow-up, not only the decision-making process, but also all the indicators. What have you seen there? And the second question, and Andrea just give us a lecture about direct public works and concessions, and especially on focus of concessions and on results in service providing and not in the means used by the private partner. You define the obligations of the concessionaire based on the expected result and not pointing out which are the pieces of equipment, materials, and the construction technique that will be used. But although this is very clear for us here in the panel and practice, at least here in Brazil, and I'm sure Edgard already had that problem, we have a misunderstanding of these distinctions between contract for public works and contract for concessions in terms of public administrations. Here, the Court of Accounts and the Public Prosecutor's Office sometimes misunderstand this concept. So my second question is, in your experience in other countries, is that the case as well? Do you also see a trend in the Court of Accounts, in the control agencies, the public administrators, trying to monitor and supervise the concession contracts with the same rationale that they use to supervise and inspect the public contracts, public work contracts?
Should Andrea take the floor first? I'll ask you all to be to the point because we have one more question and that we'd like to ask all of the panelists, and then before we move on to the closing remarks. Fine. Well, firstly, I would say that I fully agree that the value-based analysis is a tool that has limitations, and during the appraisal or the assessment, it's also, well, we have to look at the parameters, the inputs that are used in the appraisal. They should be complementary. They should not be the sole factors that will be considered in the appraisal. And I can also say that in El Salvador, at least, we are starting the PPP program that we have just kick-started, and therefore we cannot actually say much in regards to the concession contracts and value for money. And to your second question, I could also say that even though we do not have contract oversight while in operation, we have in the public sector, we have realized that they oftentimes address PPP projects as though they were public projects, public construction projects, as though these projects were to comply with the framework and the regulations that they normally use. And in El Salvador, it is something that is beginning to change, that we still have to indicate to the public sector what the differences are so they can manage these projects the best possible way. Thank you very much for your inputs. And now I'd like to bring in the questions that were asked to Marcelo, and there are questions addressed to Edgard, considering what Marcelo just shared in regards to the instruments, whether they're adequate or not, and your critique, Edgard, about value for money. What are the instruments that are available to better identify and manage the contingencies that actually arise during the PPPs? What is your experience in this regard, Edgard? What could we propose as instruments that would better manage the contingencies?
Very well. I understand, and I think here in our Brazilian experience and talking more about São Paulo's experience, we have several methodological alternatives, both value for money as well as cost-benefit analysis. We can think about stochastic analysis of fiscal risk, contingent liabilities, and so the possibilities in terms of technical methodological possibilities are huge, but all of them um, have to be considered under our institutional environment. Marcelo well mentioned that we have to analyze the evaluation of what was made and answering the question. I don't think we don't do it. I think Brazil doesn't have a good track record in terms of public policies evaluation, in terms of the concept of it. And so we end up having to look at that scenario and looking at the budget that we have, how the budgets work, the pluriannual ones work, if they do exist or not, so that we can start thinking about contingencies and see if they make sense or not. Our experience here in São Paulo is very clear. It shows us that the best way of managing the risks of the contracts and the contingencies and preparation for the state that comes from the near contract management and the independent regulating agencies that allow us to adjust incentives, because we end up having a very complicated scenario. In the contract management, we have a tariff adjustment that is not given, and you generate a benefit now, but the cost is only going to be paid further on. You have a mismatch of incentives that is mean, and the more you work in the contract itself to try to remove these incentives, to try to realign them in a way that the cost can be supported by the same decision makers that will be benefited from them, the best will be for you, the best alternatives you will have. So if you start working on a long-term idea of assessment of what was planned and the project that was brought forward and the project that was actually realized, you have to be working with those that really implemented the project. You cannot displace responsibilities. So trying to tie all these ideas together, I understand that the best way of running these assessments and to have a project over time that the project is that the risks do not materialize and do not become a real problem for the state is to have a very close contract management where you can allocate decision makers, the ones that are managing the liabilities. They will be managing the liabilities costs so that you do not have rebalancing modes that will just postpone the problem, and also provide transparency to problems. So when you materialize risks and contract costs, that needs to be clear, both for the contracts participants and also for the society, which is going to receive the services that we are trying to turn feasible by the means of a contract.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for your contributions. They're very clear. And going back to the questions to Marcelo, I would say that, yes, we do lack appraisal instruments at a global level, appropriate instruments that would allow for the appropriate assessment of the project, not only PPP assessments by large from the public sector, and this also includes PPPs. We don't lack the dynamic in the follow-up and assessment. Maybe if we had an opportunity to improve these methodologies, I would say that value for money is a tool that we can use, that is widely accepted, and maybe we could enhance this tool by bringing in or changing the dynamics. Many do the appraisal early on, upfront, and determine that the project can be a PPP project if, well, that is actually the result of the appraisal, looking at value for money. And during the project execution, as more information is obtained, maybe there could be a space to rethink, revisit, reassess the project at different phases. And this actually is done. We lack exposed evaluation or assessment tools for PPP and public management. And as Edgar mentioned, as far as we can do a closer follow-up of risks at different phases, we'll have a better understanding of the project with its full scope. And in the second round of comments, we still have a few minutes. Maybe, if you wish to make your closing remarks by sharing an idea, or what are the takeaways of the panel. So maybe we can begin with Marcelo, Andrea, and Edgard.
Thank you all very much for having participated in this panel. I think it was interesting, and I learned a lot hearing you. And as my final message and my final comment, and I think it has to do with Edgar's and Gerard's last comments. And I think that everything points to a need to have a institutional strengthening of the regulating agencies, just in terms of technical training, in terms of personnel, really, of having a better or actually a broader technical body, that people that are able to survey information in order to carry out that type of assessment from time to time, so that the structuring can be improved, and further on the management of the contracts, concession contracts, and so that at the end of the day they are able to explain to the society and to the control bodies the decisions made in different situations, because inevitably, and I think this is a little bit of the problem that we have in some situations here in Brazil, inevitably these contracts require great interaction because between public and private sectors. And to deal with all the contingencies you mentioned, we need to have both sides coming together to negotiate. And without information, without that type of study and ability of changing the needs of the needs of the contract, and to provide more transparency, it's going to be very difficult to turn concession contracts sustainable over time. So this is my final message. Institutional.
Thank you, Marcelo. Andrea, over to you for your closing remarks. Hello, Andrea. Can you hear us? Yes, I can. Excellent. What are your closing remarks, please? Would you like to share your closing remarks? Well, I would also say that I agree with all that has been shared in the panel. It's very important to have the institutional management. You can have the different tools, economic assessments, appraisals, value for money, and you can also look at the contingent liabilities. However, without the institutional approach, you won't have access to the incentives. You need to have the incentives to maximize the economic returns of the project. That is key for the PPP system. Perfect. Finally, Edgard, over to you for your closing remarks.
I agree with what Marcelo and Andrea said about stronger institutions. And as a final message, I would add something you mentioned about the importance of evaluation of what has been done, because the moment we are able to have a clearer evidence of what has worked and what has not worked, it gets easier going back to the go, no-go to projects or value for money. It's easier to make decisions based on evidence of what has worked or not. And in an institutional and clear manner, we should have documents and reports comparing actual to estimated, because in Brazil, we have things we don't do anymore because we have done it before and it didn't work. But this is not clear. This is not institutionalized. We know because the same people are here. We learn from them. But I think we should foster this culture of impact evaluation and the assessment of public policies so that we can build on that and so that we can prevent previous errors. So we should base ourselves on empirical evidence, and we should also have stronger methodologies for this area that's so important for the evolution of the whole of Latin America.
Perfect. Well, so we are going to adjourn now after the closing remarks. We've heard very clear messages looking at this gradual sluggish recovery of Latin America. Public investment is key, is paramount to foster growth through a sustainable, fiscally sustainable PPP program, which is vital. And therefore, there's a need to have better regulatory agencies, better regulation that is more dynamic and using tools that are not only designed, that are actually used throughout the PPP project. It's also key to consider what has happened with the project, how the project has evolved, based on evidence and not only on assumptions. Well, in closing, I would like to once again thank our panelists and all of the participants that have joined us in this panel. Thank you to all.